the price of inflation and stuff had taken its toll on the genie, and he only had one wish left in the lamp. Well, the man thought carefully for a moment, and then he figured out what he would wish for. He requested the stock market page for 1 year into the future. In a puff of smoke, the genie was gone, and there lying on the sand was the financial news dated a year later. Well, excitedly, the man sat down in the sand, and he opened up the financial news. He began to pursue through this treasure of his. And as he was looking at this, he just couldn't believe it. I mean, he could invest with certainty in whatever he wanted to do at this point in time. He knew the financial winners of 12 months out. He was going to be a wealthy man, as you can imagine. He could invest without question. As he sat in the sand dreaming of his newfound wealth, he dropped the paper down in his lap, and the offshore wind was gently blowing, and it was good to be alive. And the wind gently blew the pages of the paper over. And he glanced down and he saw his name. And his face went ashen, for his name was on the obituary page 1 year into the future. While we might dream about knowing what tomorrow brings, it probably would be troubling in spirit to most of us nonetheless. We all would like to know what's around the bend and around the corner, but if we really knew, we probably wouldn't like to know in reality. It might be a little unsettling to our spirit. And last week in our study in Daniel chapter 7, we saw that God gave Daniel a tour of Israel's future. And this tour that God gave Daniel revolved around the four major empires that relate to Israel. Obviously, the history of the world involves much more, but Daniel is seeing history through God's eyes relating to Israel. And in that final world empire that we saw last week from those four beasts, that one that defied description, we saw that there would be a leader come out of that final world empire whom is known by many names, and the name we know him most often by is the name Antichrist. And so Daniel, as he looked at this tour of the future, he was deeply troubled. And I didn't finish with Daniel 9:28 last week. I left that one off, kind of on purpose. This is the end of the matter. 7:28. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts. My face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. So Daniel has had the angel Gabriel come to him and give him a picture of what tomorrow holds, and all he can say is he was deeply troubled. Even though the interpretation of the vision was given to Daniel, he didn't understand it all. You and I have a benefit that Daniel didn't have. We have the entire Word of God that gives us much information that was missing to Daniel in 555 BC or so. And Daniel was perplexed, to say the least. I'm sure that he had a lot of questions in his mind as to what all the details of this vision meant. 2 years passed without further insight for Daniel. I think 2 years of kind of scratching his head, wondering what's going to take place for my people, the Jewish people, in the future. Sure, he'd had the vision, but he didn't get it all. Well, after 2 more years, Daniel receives another vision. And we come to chapter 8. 2 years have transpired between chapter 7 and chapter 8. 2 years for Daniel wondering, what is God's plan? What exactly is he going to do? When's this going to really kick into gear? For 2 years, Daniel has been questioning, and I'm sure praying, and asking God for insight. So come with me and turn with me to Daniel 8, and I want to begin reading in verse 1. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, and the date here is about 555 BC, just for a point of history, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged to the west, and then to the north, and to the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a prominent horn between his eyes. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram, I had seen standing by the canal and charged him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his two horns. Well, the ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Strange, strange vision here at this point in time. But you know what? Even though it's a strange vision, there is no question as to what it means. Because we're going to see here, the Scriptures explicitly state that the 2-horned ram represents the kingdoms of the Medes and the Persians. We're also going to see that the male goat pictured here is a representative of the conquering Greeks. And the prominent horn between the goat's eyes represents the first king, Alexander the Great. And if you'll drop down to verse 20, and we really have to do this to keep this really in perspective, we read here, the 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. And the shaggy goat is the king of Greece. And the large horn between his eyes is the first king. And so there's no question here as to who these 2 animals are representative. We were sitting around the table last evening, and Matthew said, why does God use these animals? Why does He use beasts? Why doesn't He just have the representation of the actual kingdom? And why doesn't He call them by their name? Well, I can't answer that question totally, but I can tell you right here in Daniel chapter 8, He does call them by name. Now, I want you to remember, Daniel 8 is written before the rise of the Medes and the Persians. This is about 16 years before Belshazzar is put to death, and the Medes and Persians take power. And the Greeks, well, they're 2 centuries down in history from the time of Daniel here. I mean, this is a very detailed prophecy in Daniel chapter 8. And it's important here that we see that the conquest of the goat were so swift that his feet appeared not to even touch the ground as he devoured the whole earth, as verse 5 says. It was swift what he did coming across. And history records for us that Alexander the Great swept through, really, Asia Minor. He came down into Syria. He dropped around to the south of the Mediterranean Sea and conquered Egypt. Then he came back through Israel, and he took what was then left of the Persian Empire, and he went all the way to India in a matter of 12 years. 12 years. He conquered the whole Mediterranean world all the way to India. I think I mistakenly said last week 2 years. And it was 12 years that this transpired, this conquest by Alexander. And certainly it was very, very swift, his conquering of the world. When Daniel received this vision in 555 BC, no one would have ever dreamed. The political pundits writing for the daily cuneiform newspaper there would have come back and would never have guessed that Babylonia would be history in less than 20 years. No one would ever have guessed that the Medes and the Persians together would conquer Babylon. Or that in the future, Greece would take Persia. Because the Persians will defeat the Greeks very resoundingly. And that's part of the rage that's mentioned here in the passage about the goat coming against the Medes and the Persians. The Greeks were very, very, I don't know what the right word is. They were ticked at the Persians, and they got even when Alexander began his conquest, coming back the other direction at them. So, it's interesting here in chapter 8. They are spelled out very clearly by name. We do not have to go searching through other parts of the Scriptures to find out who these 2 animals represent. I think history sheds some interesting light on the images, on the animals that are represented in this prophecy as well. And I was not aware of this until my study this week. And I learned that the Macedonians, of course, come from the area north of modern Greece. Some of you have had the privilege of taking trips to that part of the world. And the Macedonians were from the north of what is today modern Greece. They were called the Goats people. I'm serious, okay? They were known as the Goats people. And Macedonian legend has it that Carnus, the very first Macedonian king, before he became king, was advised by the oracles. The oracles were those who, through the occult and black magic, would be in touch with the spirit world. The oracles advised Carnus to take goats as his guides. Legend says that after a particularly violent storm scattered the goats and set them running, the king followed them down to the town of Edessa, where he ultimately became king and established the kingdom of the Macedonians. There he renamed the city Edessa to Aegea. You know that from the Aegean Sea. And the meaning of Aegea meant the goat's town. Carnus used the image of the goat as his ensign or his mascot. And the goat was portrayed, according to Macedonian history, on their flags that they would carry into battle. And so I think that's interesting to see how historically the Macedonians were represented by the goat. In the 4th century A.D., we are told by a historian by the name of Amanius Marcellinus, I butchered it, I'm sure, that the Persian ruler would bear the head of a ram on his head when he would go into battle. So that was, the ram's head was kind of this Persian ruler's mascot in a sense, like armor, but he would wear it on top of his head. And so we see here, I think very graphically, that from history alone, that the goat and the ram are represented in these two empires. I think it's interesting that God uses these two images to forecast them in advance as to what was coming. So we see this unfolding here. Now, Alexander the Great's empire, he was brought down, died very young age, 33 years of age, he died. After his death, 4 of his generals divided the Alexandrian conquest into 4 kingdoms. Now, it did not happen immediately. There was a period of successive kings that tried to hold the empire together, and there was faction between the military, but ultimately there were 4 generals who ended up dividing the empire into 4 various kingdoms. And those kingdoms were the kingdom of Macedonia up there in the northern part of the Mediterranean world, Asia Minor coming down around through Turkey and into the northern part just before you drop down into Lebanon. There was Egypt, the kingdom of Egypt, and the kingdom of Syria. So there were these 4 kingdoms. I know it shows 5 horns there. And the artist that I got this from shows Rome as one of the horns that ultimately takes over out of the Grecian Empire. And that's why there's a 5th horn there. And they actually say Egypt, Syria, and Thrace and Macedonia. Thrace would be that area of Asia Minor, in case you're wondering. As I'm doing my research, as I'm online looking at things, I find some of these drawings, and some of these drawings are from, the 1800s, and I love to find these old drawings. But sometimes we have different perspective than what I like to exactly say. But in lieu of taking Photoshop and removing a horn, it's just easier to leave it there. From the horn, let's come back to the text now, to Daniel chapter 8 and verse 9. So we've got these 4 horns that are divided up into the 4 winds, as we saw off, the 4 winds under heaven. Verse 9, out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east toward the beautiful land. Now the beautiful land is Israel. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and the host that will be trampled underfoot. He said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. And so here in this passage from 9 through 14, we find out that from the horn of Syria, from one of the horns, which will become Syria, would come a king that would cause particular trouble for the Jewish people. And Daniel calls this king another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. And there was a king that came out of Syria that as he developed in his strength, His first military advance was down to Egypt, and then he came home and he advanced into what is today modern Iraq and Iran, then known as Persia. And then after that, he came back to deal with the land in between, which was the beautiful land of Israel. And he had bypassed Israel in his first two conquests, but he comes back to attack them. History records for us who this particular king is. And this king historically is known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He was the horn which started small. Antiochus Epiphanes did invade Egypt and then to the Persia to the east, and finally he turned back towards Israel. This is recorded for us in the books of Maccabees in the Jewish Old Testament. Well, they only have one. In the Jewish Bible, and which would be our Old Testament, they have these books of the Maccabees. The Maccabees were those who ultimately rose up in revolt against this Syrian king and overthrew him. And the book of Maccabees is the record of that. And so that's recorded there for us. Now, Antiochus plundered the temple and set up a statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies when he finally came into Jerusalem. He then proceeded, after that, he tore down the walls surrounding Jerusalem that had been built by Nehemiah, and he confiscated all the copies of the Scriptures that he could find. He then forbade the Jews from the rite of circumcision, and he then also offered a pig upon the altar, the burnt offerings in the temple. He took pig blood, mixed it with water, and spread it all over the temple area, which you can appreciate was absolutely horrendous insult to the Jewish people, to the law of Moses, to do this. And we're told that anyone consenting or obeying the law of Moses during this time period was under a death sentence. So if you had been a Jewish person living in Jerusalem at this time and were trying to follow the law of Moses, and Antiochus or his people found out about it, you would have been put to death. That was the price. And there were those put to death for following. In fact, history records, the book of Maccabees tells us that there were 40,000 Jews that were slaughtered in Antiochus' initial taking of the city. And many, multiple thousands deported off into slavery. It was a very dark day for the Jewish people. Now, verses 13 and 14 give an interesting phrase here. They tell us that there would be 2,300 days that would pass before the cleansing of the sanctuary. That then it would be reconsecrated, so for it to be cleansed. Now, Jewish history records for us very clearly when that cleansing took place. It took place on our calendar on the 12th month, December 25th of 165 BC. Now, how did that cleansing take place? Well, I've already mentioned the Maccabean family. The Maccabees, they rose up in revolt against Antiochus, and they raised a Jewish revolt that actually came back militarily and was able to throw the yoke of Syria off of the Israeli people. And at that time, when they were able to recapture Jerusalem, they came into the temple area and they began going through the ceremonial cleansing of the temple area. It's also at that time that as they began to relight the lampstands that provided light in the temple, they realized they only had enough oil, according to Jewish tradition, for one day. And the oil had to go through a certain ceremonial process to be considered to be clean oil to be used in the lampstands in the temple. And yet, according to Jewish history and Jewish tradition both, the oil and the lampstands continued to burn for 8 days. And the oil burning for 8 days until they had enough to replenish it is the 8 days of Hanukkah. And so, if you know any Jewish people, they will use the menorah there at Hanukkah, and it has the 8 candles that are lit. Now, there's one candle that they use to light the other 8 in the center. And so, the menorah here it dates back to this time. This is the very first Hanukkah. Now, it's interesting that last year, in 2005, Hanukkah fell on December 25th. It has just rotated all the way around until last year it was on the 25th. I believe this year Hanukkah, the first day of Hanukkah, I think it falls on the 17th. I looked it up and I didn't write it down, and so I'm trying to pull from my memory to do that. But it's not the same. Because the Jewish calendar is different than the Gregorian calendar that we follow, they rotate around. And so this year, it does not fall on the 25th. This was the time of cleansing. Now, it said 2,300 days. So let's go backward 2,300 days and see what we come up with. If you go backward 2,300 days from December 25th, 165 BC, you arrive at the date of August 5th, 171 BC. What happened historically on August 5th, 171 BC? Nobody knows. There is no particular record of anything happening significantly on August 5th. That doesn't mean there wasn't something significant. We just have no record of it. But we do know that it was the year 171 BC that Antiochus began moving. His aggressions were first launched against the Jewish people in the year 171. And so from the time that Antiochus first begins the persecution of the Jewish people until the final cleansing, from the year 171 to the cleansing, which we now have Hanukkah in celebration of, it was 2,300 days, according to the vision that Daniel saw. Now, Hanukkah is obviously, celebrated this very day. It was celebrated in Jesus' day. In fact, it's interesting, in John chapter 10 and verse 22, at the Feast of Dedication, or the Feast of Lights, Jesus was in the temple area, indicating that Jesus, God in the flesh, recognized the cleansing that had gone on at the time of the first Hanukkah under the Maccabean brothers, as they had thrown off the Syrians, was complete. And he was in the temple area then. And so the Feast of Dedication, the Feast of Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights, it goes by different names, Jesus participated in John chapter 10 and verse 22. This amazing prophecy that we have here in John 8 was written 16 years before the Medes and the Persians took over from the Babylonians. This prophecy was written 200 years before Alexander the Great came on the scene historically. 300 years it was written before Antiochus Epiphanes. And it's fascinating as you study the Bible, and if you study the writings of even those who don't believe the Bible, if you study the so-called liberal Bible scholars, that's kind of an oxymoron in my opinion, but the so-called liberal critics of the Bible, even the liberal critics of the Bible agree that Daniel chapter 8 is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes in chapter 8, 1 through really 14. There's no question amongst historians that is recognizing that that's reference to Antiochus Epiphanes. So I think it's fascinating to recognize that even the liberals see Antiochus here in Daniel chapter 8. Daniel has the privilege here of receiving these details about the future. Now in chapter 7, he saw these 4 empires coming on the scene. Chapter 8, he gets more. He doesn't need more details about Babylon. Babylon's almost history. I mean, he's got another less than 2 decades left. But he gets a little bit of a picture of the Medes and the Persians coming on the scene in chapter 8. He gets a little more understanding of the Greeks coming in to take over the Medes and the Persians. And when we come to chapter 9, he's going to get more insight into the 4th empire and the one we call the Antichrist in chapter 9, which we'll look at next week. And so Daniel is getting more details about the future between Daniel's time and the coming of Messiah. Because in Daniel chapter 9, we have that wonderful, incredible prophecy about the coming of Messiah. So Daniel's having some of this information explained to him so he's got a better picture until Messiah comes. This information about Persia and Greece and Antiochus coming out of Syria, though, isn't the total picture that God gave Daniel. Come back now to verse 23, and let's continue. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper. He will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Now, there are those who love the Lord, who read Daniel 8:23 through 25, and they see this as a continued description of Antiochus. I do not believe this is a continued description of Antiochus. I think we have a shift here. It says that in latter part of their reign, talking about the reign of those who were really over Israel, in the context here, the Syrians in particular context, but we know that the fourth empire will come out of them, Rome. When rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He'll become very strong, but not by his own power. And certainly the Antichrist will be the personification of none other than Lucifer, Satan himself. He'll cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does, as Antichrist will. He'll destroy the mighty men. And as we saw last week, he will go after the holy people of the Most High God in Daniel chapter 7. He'll cause deceit to prosper. He'll consider himself superior. It says he will take a stand against the Prince of Princes. And we understand that to be none other than Messiah, the Prince of Princes. And this does not describe anything Antiochus actually did. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. And Antichrist will be destroyed, but not by human power, but by the very word that comes out of the mouth of the Lord Jesus Christ as he comes back with the armies of heaven at that final battle of Armageddon, when the Antichrist will be destroyed and thrown into the lake of fire. Revelation 19 that we looked at last week. So I believe that here in Daniel chapter 8, while the majority of the chapter is dealing with the time of from the Medes and the Persians through the Greeks into Syria for the Jewish people, talking about the atrocities of Antiochus Epiphanes, that we also have a picture here in Antiochus of being a representative of the Antichrist who comes later. And I think 23 through 25 is a further description of the activities of the Antichrist himself. This stern-faced king he's called here. And I read this week, I thought this was an interesting comment by a writer who was quoting somebody else, and he did not source them, so I can't tell you who said this originally. But he made the observation that Greece, with all of its refinement, culture, art, produced Antiochus Epiphanes, who is often called the Antichrist of the Old Testament, and because of what he did to the Jewish people. And it's also interesting that it will be the Antichrist. The Antichrist will be born out of the vestiges of the so-called Christian West, the Roman Empire. And it's interesting, if you were to talk to those who are Jewish today, they would perceive Rome, after the embracing of Christianity, to be a Christian empire. And it's interesting that out of the so-called Christian empire, Antichrist will arise in the future. Now, I want you to notice how all this affects Daniel. Come down to the last verse of this chapter. I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. Daniel's probably in his mid to late 60s at this point. And early in Belshazzar's reign, we gather from this verse that Daniel still had some kind of business he was doing for the king. But I think it's important here to see that he was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Daniel has had an incredible spiritual experience here. And there's a principle in life that as we come through what I would call mountaintop spiritual experiences, after that, we often are totally exhausted. If as a young person you had the privilege of going to a camp and really enjoying the high of being in a camp where you were taught the Word of God and decisions were made for Christ, oftentimes kids come home from camp and they spiritually crash. What happened? That's a normal principle of life. You look at Elijah coming off of Mount Carmel. That is at 1 Kings 17, I believe. And he comes off the mountain. I mean, he has just done battle with the prophets of Baal up there. You remember the picture from Sunday school, right? Of they're on top of the mountain, and the prophets of Baal are up there, and they got their altar set up, and they've got their sacrifices, and they're trying to call down, Baal to take the sacrifice and burn it up. And they're up there all day long, and they're up there dancing around the thing, and they're cutting themselves with stones and knives, trying to placate Baal, and Baal doesn't do it. Elijah says, maybe you guys should shout a little louder. Maybe your God's not there right now. Maybe he's out to lunch or whatever. And Elijah gets up there and he prays, and fire comes down from heaven. Not only consume, and Elijah has to put water on first. Remember that story? Pours water over the sacrifice. Elijah prays, and fire comes down from heaven and doesn't just consume the sacrifice. It burns up the stones. I mean, it's gone. Pretty amazing spiritual high. If you were Elijah, I think you'd be pretty high. But where do we find Elijah next? He's running a wicked queen, Jezebel. He's hiding in the desert. He feels like he's the only one of God's prophets left, and he's got a real pity party going on right after that spiritual high. And I think there's a principle here that you and I need to remember. And I forget who I heard this from, but it's the clenched fist principle. Clench a fist. Clench your fist right now. Clench it while you're sitting here. Come on, play along with me. Clench your fist, okay? Clench your fist. Make it as tight as you can. Hold it as tight as you can. Now, some of you will hold it longer than others because some of you have stronger hands than others. But eventually, everybody in here is going to have to relax your hand. Because you can only be under stress and pressure for so long, and you've got to relax. And the same thing is a principle here. I think it applies to our spiritual lives. We go through the excitement of going through that spiritual, perhaps even pressure and tension of experiencing that, and we come down, and there is a natural tendency to let down. And Daniel has gone through a tremendous amount of pressure. He has had a high spiritual experience here. I mean, he's met Gabriel. How many angels are named in the Bible? Jeopardy quiz here. I'm Alex Trebek. How many angels are named in the Bible? Who can tell me how many angels are named in the Bible? 2, because you read the study notes, I hope. And I think it's in there. Actually, the study notes are wrong. They're wrong. There are actually 3 angels named in the Bible. The first one is Gabriel. The next one is Michael, the archangel. And then who's the next one, Michaela? Lucifer. That's right. But when I say angels, we tend to think of the ones who aren't fallen. And so there's only 2. Now you say, but what about all these traditions of other angels? That's just that. They're traditions. There's only 3 that are mentioned. Lucifer, Gabriel, and Michael, the archangel. So Daniel's just met one of the 3 who are named. Gabriel. Pretty impressive experience, to say the least. This is the same one who's going to meet with who? Later? In about 500 years? Mary. And who else does he meet with? Elizabeth. So, we've got this experience that Daniel's gone through, and it says that he was exhausted and lay ill for several days. He was exhausted from it. Personally, I've experienced in my own life that Mondays are not a good day for me. I'm wiped out on Mondays. You say, all you did was teach for an hour or so. I know, but I don't make major important decisions on Mondays. Kathy and I try to avoid that. It's just it's a day where I'm just exhausted. And I know from many of my friends from the past who've been pastors that the same is true. And Mondays are just a tough day. I don't beat myself up anymore. I recognize it. I just live with it. That's just the way life is. And Daniel was there. Daniel didn't understand what was unfolding here. What a privilege you and I have here in the 21st century. Beyond Daniel. You got something Daniel didn't have? You and I have the whole picture that God wants mankind to know. We got the whole picture here. And that's why when we come to the Olivet Discourse that Jesus gave to his men just 2 days before he was really arrested and put to death, and when we put the Olivet Discourse and the book of Revelation together, it's not a mystery. Well, sure, there's things we don't totally understand, but the mystery is greatly clarified for you and I. We can see things Daniel never saw. You realize that you know stuff Daniel didn't know? Isn't that amazing? I mean, that's a privilege that you and I have today because we have the completed Word of God. Daniel didn't go past Daniel. That's all he had. He didn't know what came next. He didn't have Jesus teaching on the Mount of Olives. He didn't have John's vision from Revelation. Chapter 8 and chapter 9 of Daniel are 2 very detailed prophecies. And it's because of the detail of chapter 8 particularly that the Bible critic says that this wasn't written by Daniel. it's because of the detail here that they say it wasn't written by Daniel. They say it couldn't have been written by a guy in the 6th century BC. It's too detailed about Antiochus, about the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks. Can't happen. Had to be written after the death of Antiochus. That's what the critic says. And yet, throughout the book of Daniel, we see here that everything about this book says it was written by Daniel. Even right here at the beginning, it says, in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel. It's written by a guy who claims to be Daniel. Now, if it's not, he's a liar, and he's misrepresenting the truth. And we've seen as we've gone through this book that there is both linguistic, there is historical, there is archaeological proof. This has all the earmarkings of being written by a guy in the 6th century BC. And we have the information that this book was translated into the Greek in Alexandria, Egypt. Conservative scholar says in 235 BC, before Antiochus was even born. We have the record that this is indeed written before it happened. Now, how can that be? Well, the reason the critics want to make this written after the death of Antiochus is because if it wasn't written before if it was written before his death, it's supernaturally inspired. There's no way that Daniel could have known this information beforehand. And so because they don't want to acknowledge that there is a God and that this is His written word, they've got to change the date that this was written in. But again, everything says the book was written. The fulfilled prophecy of Daniel chapter 8 ought to excite the socks off your feet. It really should. I mean, if you think about it, here's Daniel looking down the corridors of history, and he calls it just the way it is. Why? Because God gave him the vision of what was going to unfold. Fulfilled prophecy is a great proof of the reality that the book that you hold in your hands this morning, the book that you study out of, is indeed God's written word. And it cannot be denied. Now, prophecy about Antichrist isn't something that we should be afraid of. It shouldn't cause us fear, for believers particularly. I want you to remember, and I hope that by the time we get through with this study, probably in June, that, not with Daniel, but as we go through the book of Revelation 2, as we come to the end of this, I hope this verse becomes very important to you. 1 Thessalonians 5:9. For God did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. That's a promise that should really kind of get a hold of our little brains up in here and run around the canyons of our mind occasionally. That God did not appoint us to suffer wrath as believers in Christ. And so the thought of Christ's return and the thought of being alive as these final events begin to unfold should not cause us fear. They really shouldn't. Anticipation? I think so. But there's nothing wrong with anticipation. Anticipation is not evil. It's not bad. I remember so vividly the anticipation I had at the start of our wedding ceremony. Yeah, that's me. Kathy, you can always spot. That's not her first husband. That's me. You can always spot Kathy. She hasn't changed. I've accused her that her father wasn't really who she thinks was her father. I've accused Kathy of her father was actually Dick Clark. But, I was filled with anticipation. I was filled with anticipation that evening. I can recall, it's so vivid in my mind, before the ceremony. I was nervous. I was a little scared. But I was excited. All those things. And most of you can identify with those feelings. I trust that you can recall on your wedding day. And I remember standing in the hallway. The church was like this, only much larger. And there was a hallway back here. And the pastor and I were standing in this dark hallway. And the violin solo by one of our best friends was being done. And waiting for Marilyn to finish her violin solo. And I'm standing there in the dark. And my hands are wet. They're sweaty. And I got a twitch in my face. I'm sure that when I walk out there, everybody's going to see it. Nobody did, of course. So I got this twitch in my eye, and going, I'm nervous. And I remember thinking, these are the thoughts that come back. They're as vivid today as they were like it was yesterday. I thought, man, take a deep breath. A lot of other guys before you got married. You can get through this. That's exactly what I thought. And about that time, the pastor leans over and says, you ready? I go, yeah. And we walked out, and we stood in the center of the church, large church, seated 1,200 people. Long, long aisle. And I'm looking back there at the doors are closed, and suddenly the organ music begins to play. And they swing open the doors, and there stands my beautiful bride. All of the nervousness and the fear kind of was gone when I saw Kathy. Gentlemen, those of you who have had that privilege, you know of what I speak. And it was a wonderful experience. So anticipation isn't wrong, and a little nervousness is okay. The unfolding of God's plan should excite us as much as that experience on our wedding day did. The coming of Christ, Christ's return, is really like a glass of iced tea on a hot summer's day, to be looked forward to and to be savored. Nothing better than a big glass of iced tea. I like it with a little lemonade in it, and just sitting back and enjoying a warm summer day. It's like waiting for family or friends to arrive. When we have friends or family coming from other parts of the country or the state, we know roughly the hour. We know they're going to be here on Saturday, and we know roughly they're going to be here between, say, 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock. Do you know what happens around 2 o'clock? I walk over in our living room, I start watching out the window down the street. And I do. I keep watching, and I keep wondering. I look at my watch, and this happened well before cell phones were invented. And I'd watch, and if it was a nice day out, we'd go out and we'd sit in the front porch, and we'd look down the driveway, and we'd wait, and we were excited. But not only were we excited about our friends or our family coming, we would. You know what we would do? We'd actually get the house. We'd go around the house. We'd clean. We'd vacuum everything. And we had time. We'd even wash the windows so they could enjoy the view out of our sparkling windows, which probably only get washed when we have guests. And I'd go out and I'd mow the lawn that morning, and I'd wash the walks down in preparation for our guests to come. I'd go in my garage and I'd do an extra special job of kind of straightening it, organizing it, and sweeping the floor up again, getting all the sawdust all out. We were looking forward for our guests coming. You do the same thing to some degree or another. Maybe you're not quite as I don't know what the word is that we do, but you all get ready, don't you, when guests are coming? How much more should we get ready for the coming of the King? And the King is coming. The King is coming. In our lives, we should get them in order for the King. I think prophecy, the study of prophecy, is a great call for us to live holy. It's a reminder to live holy. We don't know when the King is coming. Might be in your lifetime. Might not be. I think it's going to be, but it might not be. The King is coming. Are you ready? Are you watching? Are you looking down the street? Is your house in order? Is your house in order? My Heart, Christ's Home. Great little booklet written back in the 50s, I think. Wonderful little story. Is your house in order for the coming of the King? It should instill in us a desire to let others know the King is coming as well. Really should. So they can be ready and watching and waiting. Are you ready this morning? Are you ready this morning? Are you watching down the street? Checking the driveway? With anticipation? What a